Hi and welcome back to another Girl Gone London video. My name is Kaylin and I'm a dual UK and US citizen, and today we're taking a look at a subject I actually guarantee you have wondered about at least one time in your life, and that is house numbering. And if we're talking about things I've always wondered about, as someone who's always on the lookout for UK versus US differences, why are UK house numbers relatively small, 1 or 2 digit numbers usually, compared to the US where you can easily have a 4 or 5 digit house number? At the very least in the US, being from Florida, I'm used to a 3 or 4 digit house number. Now let's jump right in and start with the UK to see what we can find out before moving across the pond. The history of house numbers in the UK dates back to the 1700s. Before then, businesses would use a sign out front to help show people what they did there, while people sending mail to private homes would basically just describe the address the best they could, similar to how you might describe a house to somebody that you're giving directions to in modern day. So you would say something like, the yellow house on the corner with a blue plant out front. I don't know what plant is blue, it just came to my mind, but you're basically describing what the house looks like. However, this started getting a little bit confusing, as you can imagine, and so people did start numbering houses. Except they kind of just made them up and there was no regulation as to what numbering system you were supposed to use. So now the poor postman was still having to search far and wide for the right number because it made no logical sense, even if now there was a number instead of just a direction about finding the black door with the silver doorknob or similar. Now, fun fact, according to the Postal Museum, one of the first streets that was numbered was a street in London called Prescott Street, and this started in 1708. So you can have an idea of the timeline of the numbering system in the UK. Now, when doing my research on this topic, and let it be known that I do actually aim to bring you correct information in these videos instead of just repeating the first thing I read online, there are sources that say there was an act of parliament in 1765 called the Postage Act that made it so that every house now had to have a number. But this claim is not actually supported when you read the 1765 Postage Act, and I can't actually find a reputable source that says this, despite it being spread across the internet. The one source I do trust, the British Postal Museum, suggests that the regulation of house numbers in the UK did not start until 1855, when, as they put it, the power and control to regulate the naming and numbering of streets and houses were finally set out in law. Of course, part of the process and pressure to do this came from the post office because they were so over all of the numbering hijinks and were like, if you want your mail, we're gonna have to do this differently. The work of standardizing house numbers did take some time, as you can imagine, but today the actual numbering system in the UK is relatively simple. The numbers are based on the street the houses are on. This becomes interesting when we talk about the US in a minute, but if you have 10 houses on Church Lane, they'll be numbered 1 to 10, with odd numbers on the left-hand side and even numbers to the right-hand side usually. If a house has been added later on, like if one house is split into 2 maisonettes or something like that, it may be given a suffix like an A or a B. This is why UK house numbers are quite small, as you would need over 100 houses on the same street to get up to the 3-digit numbers, and that usually doesn't happen. It does on occasion though. For instance, Stratford Road near Birmingham goes up to 2,679, or what I might say 2679 as the house number. So as with anything, we can make generalizations, but there's always going to be some instances where we can just as easily prove ourselves wrong. But overall, the house numbers in the UK tend to be small. Some other fun facts about the UK numbering system. Typically, the lowest numbers will start at the end of the street that's closest to a town or village center. It's extremely rare for any house to be a 0 number, and occasionally there are large plots of land or open land, like a row along a river, where houses are going to be numbered consecutively on just one side of the street. You can also have a name for your house in the UK and display this name on the front of your home, but if a home has ever been given an allocated house number, you must display this in addition to the name. There are homes that do only have house names and not house numbers, and then this house name is part of the official address of the home. So let's move on to the American numbering system. Why are American house numbers so big then? Is it because we have over 10,000 houses on the same street to get those large 5-digit house numbers? No, not quite. So the history of American house numbers, according to the New York Post, came from the British, who were numbering houses in the colonies in order to keep track of revolutionaries. So really, it was a way to make sure they knew where the trouble was coming from. Then, in 1790, an advisor to George Washington thought they should do a little bit of standardization and came up with the Philadelphia system, where you had odd and even numbers on alternate sides of the street, a very similar system to what is used in much of the world today. Now, of course, in my research on this, sources like the Financial Times and New York Post assert that America came up with this numbering system, whereas other sources suggest that Napoleon came up with it and that it was used across Europe first. So you can make up your own mind. I've linked the Financial Times article in the description, which I feel is the most authoritative resource I could find. But that still doesn't explain how Americans actually number their houses. As we talked about, UK house numbering typically starts at one end of the street and numbers all of the homes on this street. This is one of the options in the US, but actually there are two more popular options. One is that the street is numbered from the most recent intersection, typically in sets of hundreds, so you would skip up to the next 100 when you get to the next cross street. This only works in a gridded format though, so it's really only going to be seen in cities across America. Another popular way of numbering, particularly in the suburbs, is that numbers are based on how far the house is away from a central basing point. So it could be like a natural basing point, like a river or a lake, or it could be the central business district or a town hall or a railroad, whatever they come up with. And the house numbers then increase by a certain amount based on their distance from this baseline. So it could increase by 1,000 for every mile. So you end up with much larger numbers that don't necessarily make a huge amount of sense in the context of the street, but would make more sense if you knew the actual basing point and the larger system of measurement within this community. So here's an example of literally a random street I found in Florida. This is Turnbull Cove Drive. Never been there. It looks to have about 45 houses on it. In the UK system, you'd probably expect the houses to be numbered 1 through 45. But if we take a closer look, in the US, we've got numbers in the 2700s and 2800s, and at one point, it seems to be making sense 2758, 2760, and then instead of 2762, we're all of a sudden on 2800. One thing to note and emphasize, in the US, there is a huge amount of variability when it comes to the house numbering systems by region and by city. So if this doesn't follow your experience, let us know the system near you. Now, I don't always make a judgment call at the end of my videos between the two countries, but on this one, I'm gonna have to say we've got to give the win to the UK when it comes to the more sensical numbering system to the average person, though I do think there's something grander sounding about living at house number 1542 or 810 than number 2 or number 7. This brings us to the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.